Okay, now we're going to have a look at the Giver chapter 18. Jonas comes in and he asks the Giver if he ever thinks about his release. This opens up a whole discussion because the Giver responds that he's not allowed to think about release or apply for release until the new receiver is trained, and that makes sense because he has the memories, and he has to give the memories over, otherwise the memories get lost. And Jonas says that he can't request release either. And it's in this chapter we discover why Jonas is not allowed to request release. And this is when we hear more about the previous receiver in training. The Giver starts talking about her, that she was a female, and that her name was Rosemary. There we go. And that she was very self-possessed and serene. Meaning that she was in control of herself and she was calm, intelligent, eager to learn. These are descriptions of her, which is similar to Jonas, right? And he's basically talking about his memories of her. It was obvious that he's very fond of her. He liked her a lot, had a strong connection to her. He actually says, I loved her. Okay. And the training started very nicely. And he remembers how she really enjoyed him teaching her, him showing her good memories. He says, I remember her laughter. And then we have the story of what happened to her, and it's a very sad one. The Giver says, it broke my heart, Jonas, to transfer pain to her, but it was my job. It was what I had to do, the way I've had to do it to you. Okay, this is very important because we remember that in society there are things that are not good in every society. For example, the difference between very, very rich people and very, very poor people, people who suffer from violence, people who suffer from neglect. And we kind of accept things. There are very few people who say, no, this has to stop, we're going to make a protest. And the same is in Jonas's society. The Giver, even though he's intelligent and he's somebody who thinks about things, he says it was my job, right? So that's he has to give over these terribly painful memories to this poor girl, and that's what he says. There's no choice. This is what I have to do. This is the way things are. Okay, so she is with him for 5 weeks. He gives her happy memories of kittens and merry-go-rounds and all sorts of things. And then he says, she was like you, Jonas. She wanted to experience everything. She knew that it was her responsibility. And then she actually asks. So she asked me for more difficult memories. So Jonas says, did you give her war? And he says, no, I didn't give her war. I gave her physical pain. I gave her loneliness. And I gave her loss. Ovdan. Okay? He transfers a memory of a child taking from his parents. That was the first one. And Jonas really, it's almost as if the Giver is transferring a memory of Rosemary, even though he's just talking about it, because he sees her in his eye. Jonas actually sees Rosemary in front of me as a vision of her. It's very, very strong. And he says that once he gave her the memory of pain, everything changed. Jonas says maybe she wasn't brave enough. He says, no, it's not true. She insisted that I continue. So he says, I couldn't bring myself to inflict physical pain on her. I imagine that he wouldn't do it because she was a girl, and maybe he figured that she's not strong as Jonas. I don't want to be sexist or anything, but I'm just imagining. But he says, I gave her anguish. Anguish is a type of, is very, very strong emotional pain. Okay, anguish. Poverty, being very, very poor, hunger and terror. And again, he says, I had to. It was my job. And she had been chosen. Again, like people in this society, they don't get to choose what they do. They are chosen. Okay, so finally, it was the last session, and she comes up to him and she gives him a hug and a kiss. Obviously, we know that this sort of stuff is not allowed in the community. What is going on behind the doors with the giver is something that is very separate from what else is in the community. And she goes back, and she leaves the room. She doesn't go back to her dwelling, and he's notified by the speaker that she'd gone to the chief elder and asked to be released. And Jonah says, "But hang on a minute, it's against the rules. Receiver and training can't apply." But the giver says, "No, these are your rules, okay? It wasn't in hers. So this is the whole reason why Jonas isn't allowed to apply for release, because of what happened to Rosemary, okay? So it was a failure, and it was something that made the giver very sad. And he says the giver needed a successor, and he had been chosen. Successor is somebody who goes after the previous person, okay? So then Jonas has this thought that Rosemary had been released very early in her training, but what if something happened to him now? He's got a whole year's worth of memory, so now we know we're like 1 year on with this process. Just underlining that. And then Jonas asks, well, I can't request release, but what if something happens? What if I fell into the river? Okay, I just want to point out, I'm going to put the river in blue here, that the river is it's a very strong image it's a symbol in the symbol. It's a symbol in the book, and it's a symbol of something that divides what we have right now and what is beyond. Okay, and it's also something. The river is something which has a connotation of danger, because if you remember the little Caleb who fell into the river and drowned. Okay, so he says, well, what if I fell into the river and was lost? There was not going to be a new receiver. What would you do with all these these important memories that were lost? The giver says to him, "You just stay away from the river, my friend. The community lost Rosemary after 5 weeks, and it was a disaster for them. I don't know what the community would do if they lost you." So again, now Jonas has become somebody who is sacrificing himself for everybody else. Okay, Jonas is no longer in control of what happens, because he's got these memories, and these memories belong to the community in a way. Like Jonas is a possession of the community. And if you remember that Jonas, okay, it sounds like Jonah. Yonah, do you remember? And the whale, do you remember Jonas and the whale, the story in the Tanakh, where he has to make a sacrifice for the people of Nineveh, okay? That he's been told to do something, he doesn't want to do it, and he is a representative of a lot of people. You can look up the story of Jonah and find the similarities, but all the names are like very important. So Jonas is an important one. Okay, so where was I? So he says you have to stay away. You've got to protect yourself. And again, he reminds us of the how the community was overwhelmed with all these feelings that they'd never experienced before. And he's devastated. He was devastated at his own grief, the loss of Rosemary. And then he says to Jonas, well, if they lost you with all the training you've had now, they'd have all those memories again themselves. And Jonas says they'd hate that. And he says they certainly would. They wouldn't know how to deal with it all. And Jonas says the only way he deals with it is having the giver to help him. But then the giver has a thought, and he says, I suppose that I could. And then he says, well, if you floated off in the river, I suppose I could help the whole community the way I've helped you. It's an interesting concept. I need to think about it some more. Maybe we'll talk about it again sometime, but not now. And Jonas says, I'm glad I'm a good swimmer. The giver says to Jonah, I'm glad you're a good swimmer, but stay away from the river, and they have a little laugh. But a thought has been put into Jonas's mind.